In forgotten corners of Asia, where the fog clings to rice paddies like secrets to the tongue, there are villages untouched by time and watched by the dead. This is folk fear, where ancestral silence speaks louder than screams, where every ritual has a cost and every offering is remembered by something older than gods. Here, we unearth the stories whispered behind closed altars, where curses are inherited like heirlooms, and spirits do not rest, they wait. Tonight, we travel to a village hidden beneath mist and memory, a place they call Widow's Hollow. They say no birds sing there, no children are born there, and hanging in the hallway of an old house, a lantern carved from bone still weeps for a wedding that never was. This is a tale of betrayal sealed in blood, of a ghost bride who was never buried, and of a woman who came home to bury her past, only to discover it had never died. Light your incense, lock the door. The bone lantern of Widow's Hollow is about to begin. The road narrowed long before Lean could see the village. It wound like a cracked serpent between overgrown rice fields and forest walls where the trees leaned too close. Fog clung low to the earth, thick enough to blur the path's edges, thick enough to forget time. The further she drove, the more her phone lost signal. By the time she reached the wooden bridge marked by two crumbling lion statues, her screen had gone dark. No bars, no maps, just her name blinking back at her and a notification she couldn't open. She stopped the motorbike and removed her helmet. The silence hit her first. No bird song, no insects, not even the distant bark of a village dog. Only the wind through trees and the sound of her own breath, uneasy and shallow. She had returned. Back to the place her grandmother once said must never be named out loud. Back to a village that even her own mother refused to speak of. Back to Widow's Hollow. The name wasn't on any official map. Even on old censuses, it was recorded under a different name, Lang Huilang, the village of still water. But everyone who came here knew it by another name, a whispered one, a name tied to funerals and missing daughters and lanterns that cried in the night. The moment she crossed the bridge, something in her gut twisted. A pressure, not pain, not fear, but a quiet warning. Like when you're in a room where someone has just wept. The village houses stood low to the ground, built from timber and stone, their roofs heavy with moss and sagging from years of rain. Windows were shuttered even though it was morning. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, but no one stood in the street. No children played, no old men squatted with cups of green tea. It was as if the village had stopped waiting. Her grandmother had died 3 days ago. Peacefully, they'd said. In her sleep, they'd claimed. But when Lin had spoken to the only relative who still answered her calls, a cousin named T, he hesitated before adding, "She died facing the lantern." Lin didn't know what that meant, not then, but she was about to learn. Her grandmother's house was the tallest in the village, 3 stories, though only 2 could be seen from the front. The 3rd level was buried in the rear slope of the hill, where the earth fell away into a forested basin. Widow's Hollow stretched behind it, shrouded in mist like a forgotten wound. The front door was unlocked. The air inside smelled of sandalwood, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Dust coated the surfaces. On the altar sat 3 bowls of uncooked rice and 2 sticks of incense burned to the base. Lean removed her shoes and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath her weight. On the hallway wall, just past the family altar, hung a lantern.
It wasn't electric. It wasn't glass. It was pale and bone-colored, shaped like a narrow cage, strung with red thread that wrapped around its joints like veins. And it was weeping. Tiny beads of black liquid slid down its edges, collecting into the shallow dish beneath. They smelled faintly sweet, like lotus and rot. Lean stared at it, unsure whether to touch it, bow to it, or run. She chose none. Instead, she called out, "Hello? Tea?" No answer. She wandered deeper into the house, the floor whispering under her steps. Photographs lined the hall, faded portraits of her ancestors, all women, all in red or white, none of them smiling. At the end of the corridor was her grandmother's room. A white cloth had been nailed over the doorframe, a mourning shroud marked with 3 drops of dried chicken blood. She reached for the cloth to lift it, but stopped because she heard something. Soft breathing from inside the room. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Then a knock. One knock. From the other side. She jerked away, heart racing. "Tea?" she called again, louder this time. Footsteps behind her. She spun. A boy stood at the edge of the hallway, thin, maybe 10 years old, bare feet dirty with soil. His eyes were wide and glassy, staring past her. But what are you doing?" But the boy turned and ran, without sound, down the stairs. Lean followed him, but when she reached the lower floor, there was no trace of him, no footprints, no door left open. Only the lantern remained, still dripping, its light flickering softly in the still air. That night, Lean stayed in the guest room. She lit a single candle and kept her grandmother's dog-eared diary on the table beside her. Tea hadn't returned. The villagers had kept their distance, and the lantern kept weeping. She could hear it, a soft, wet plink, 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 every few seconds, as if someone were crying into a basin. She tried to sleep, but at 3:11 a.m., she awoke to find the candle extinguished, the room colder than before, and the diary opened on its own. Its pages fluttered in a breeze that didn't come from outside. The page it landed on was blank, except for one sentence written in red ink. "Do not light the bone lantern after midnight. Not unless you're ready to marry the dead." Lean closed the diary with trembling fingers. Outside, in the hallway, the lantern flared for just a moment, and she swore she saw a shadow in a red bridal veil pass across the wall. The mist never left. Even when the sun rose, pale and tired behind the clouds, it could not push back the fog that hugged the earth like a burial shroud. It moved slowly through the trees, curling around roots and drifting between wooden stilts. The villagers walked through it like ghosts, eyes low, mouths silent. Lien stood at the kitchen window, watching them pass. A woman carrying a bundle of incense sticks crossed the yard without once looking toward the house. A hunched old man mumbled something and scattered salt along the gate. None of them waved. None knocked. She boiled water for tea and waited for her cousin T to return. He had said he'd meet her again this morning, but now it was nearly noon, and the lantern had begun to weep again, thicker this time, its dark fluid forming sluggish lines down the altar wall. Lien sat, diary in her lap. She flipped through its brittle pages. Half the entries were mundane, planting schedules, remedies for illness, names of those who owed her grandmother favors. But toward the back, the tone changed. The dreams have returned. The bride walks the stairs again. Hung the lantern after the dog barked. It cried immediately. Woke to the sound of wedding drums. There are no weddings in Widow's Hollow. The next entry had no date, just a single phrase scrawled in shaking ink. Don't speak her name near the hollow. That afternoon, curiosity gnawed at Lien's spine. She slipped on her grandmother's woven sandals, tied her long hair into a loose braid, and stepped outside, into the breath of the forest. The back of the house sloped down into a sunken stretch of land choked with trees and stone, Widow's Hollow. It was more of a basin than a clearing, circular and unnaturally still. No wind moved here, and the trees leaned inward as though drawn by something buried. The path down was narrow, barely more than trampled grass and muddy stones. She descended slowly, her breath frosting despite the warmth of the season. At the edge of the hollow stood a shrine almost consumed by roots. It was Taoist, judging by the faded octagonal symbols on its surface. The roof had caved in, and vines crept over the statue inside, a robed figure whose face had been deliberately scratched away. Beside it lay burnt sticks of incense, all of them blackened at the base, as if snuffed out too quickly. But what chilled her wasn't the shrine. It was what sat beside it. A small square of earth, neatly marked with 4 boundary stones. And at the center, the half-buried remnants of a paper coffin. Its charred edges curled like dried leaves, bits of scorched silk stuck to the soil. The scent of burnt sandalwood clung to it still. Next to the coffin lay fragments of broken jade, carved in floral patterns. A dowry. She stared at the sight, heart tightening. Who had been buried here? Why paper? Why burn it? Ghost marriage, she remembered suddenly. In rural traditions, when a woman died unmarried, her soul was said to be restless, unable to cross into the ancestral realm. To calm her, the family would arrange a symbolic marriage, burning a paper groom, paper money, paper house, even a paper coffin, and bury it in her name. But this felt different. There was no plaque, no incense left upright, no respect. This wasn't a ceremony. It was a silencing. Behind the shrine, Lien noticed a red thread wound tightly around a tree branch. It trailed downward like a vein, ending at a rusted hook embedded in the soil. And from that hook dangled something small and gray, a lock of hair, still tied with red silk, still damp. She turned, the air shifting suddenly colder. A rustle of fabric, the sound of bare feet on wet ground. Lien spun, but no one was there. Only the trees, only the fog, only the feeling that someone had just stepped away from her shoulder. She left the hollow, heart thudding, hands cold. But before she could reach the steps back to the house, a dog barked. A sharp, high bark, then silence. She looked up and saw a thin white dog at the top of the hill. It stood still as a statue, eyes locked on her, tail stiff. Then it turned and disappeared into the brush. When she returned to the house, the lantern's flame had turned blue, and its weeping had stopped. But now on the altar beside it lay something that hadn't been there before. A wedding comb, carved in ivory, streaked with something dark and sticky. tied around it a strand of black hair, not hers. That night the dreams came. Lien stood in the hollow, barefoot, her skin covered in soot. A wedding procession moved slowly around her, paper figures walking in a circle, heads bowed. She could not see their faces. They carried parasols made of bones and played flutes that made no sound. At the center of the circle was a bride in red silk, her veil dragging behind her like a funeral shroud. When she lifted it, her face was Lien's, but with eyes hollowed out and a black smile carved too wide. The lantern floated over her head, dripping. "Say yes," the bride whispered. "Let me be born again." Lien screamed and awoke to find her door ajar, and black footprints, small, barefoot, wet, trailing from the hallway to the foot of her bed.
By the third day, Lien stopped pretending the house was empty. It wasn't the way the lantern dripped at night. It wasn't even the way the diary pages turned by themselves when she looked away. It was the silence that felt inhabited, heavy, watching. A silence that grew teeth when you turned your back. She no longer slept in the guest room. She moved your blankets to the living room, near the altar, where at least the open windows let in some light and the air didn't carry the scent of old prayers and forgotten ash. But even here, she wasn't alone. The lantern had begun to change. Its light, once a dull orange flicker, now pulsed with faint blue. Sometimes it went dark entirely, only to flare again the moment her eyes met it, like it knew. And it had started crying. Not just the slow drip of black ichor she'd seen before. Now there were sounds, wet, soft sobs, the kind a person makes when they're trying not to be heard. At first she thought it was the wind. Then she pressed her ear to the lantern and heard a woman's voice whisper, "I was promised." Later that day, her cousin Thee finally returned. He stood at the threshold of the house and wouldn't come in. His hands trembled, and he wouldn't look past the altar. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. Lien crossed her arms. "You invited me." "I sent the message, but I hoped you'd ignore it." She stared. "What are you talking about?" He avoided her eyes. "Grandmother didn't want you here. She left instructions, but they changed. 3 days before she died, she burned her will and rewrote it by hand. She said you had to come, that you were the only one left." "Left for what?" He swallowed. "To keep the bride asleep." Lien froze. "What bride?" He gestured toward the lantern, but never looked at it. Her. They sat outside beneath the porch overhang. A drizzle had begun, cold and thin. Thee spoke in a low voice, as if the trees might be listening. "Before the war, before the French even came, this village had a daughter, beautiful, promised to a wealthy merchant's son. But the night before her wedding, the merchant broke the promise, married someone else, for politics, for money, who knows. She drowned herself in the hollow, slit her dress, tied her ankles with wedding ribbon, and stepped into the pond where the shrine used to be." Lien shivered. "And the villagers just left her?" "No, they buried her properly. Then they buried the shame." He picked at the skin on his thumb. "But she came back. Not as a ghost, as a bride without a groom, angry, hungry. The priest said she wasn't haunting the village, she was waiting for the ceremony to finish. So they made her a marriage, a ghost wedding." Lien's chest tightened. "Using what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he finally looked toward the house. "They say the lantern is made from her bones, her pelvis carved into a bridal cage. The light is her longing. The tears are everything else."
Lien felt something cold move through her stomach. "She cried the night grandmother died," Thea added. "We heard her wailing before dawn." That night, the crying began earlier than usual. Lien didn't try to ignore it. She placed the lantern on the table, sat across from it, and stared. Its bone cage glowed faintly. The carved talisman symbols around the base pulsed like veins, faded calligraphy from some long-forgotten Taoist binding. She lit incense, whispered the only prayer she remembered from childhood. The crying stopped. For a moment, there was only the hush of wind through bamboo. Then, a voice. Not spoken, not even whispered, a presence in her mind, forming words as sensations. "You have her blood. She took what was mine. Now you must give me yours." Lien's nose began to bleed. The lantern's light flared red. The next morning she found muddy footprints on the porch, small, barefoot, pacing in circles. The villagers still wouldn't meet her gaze, but one woman slipped a folded piece of paper in her hand during a visit to the shrine. It read, "Leave before the blood moon, or she will walk again in your skin." That night the diary opened by itself again. A new page, new ink, not her grandmother's handwriting. "Bride of bones, bride of sorrow, I was promised, I will be born." The page bled through, black tears staining the wood beneath. On the fourth night the child returned. The same boy, dirt on his feet, hollow eyes. He stood in the hallway staring at the lantern. Lien called him softly. He turned. His face was empty, and when he opened his mouth to speak, it wasn't his voice that came out. It was hers, the bride's. "Burn the dowry, light the veil, the wedding must begin." Then he vanished, like mist in morning light. Lien tried to destroy the lantern. She took it to the yard and struck it against the rocks. The bone wouldn't break. She doused it in lamp oil and lit a match. It didn't burn. Instead, it laughed, a soft, sobbing sound that rose and fell like a hymn, and the flame turned crimson. Just before midnight, it whispered one final time, "You wear her face. You carry her shame. I will come through your blood." Then the weeping resumed, slow, relentless, the lantern crying for a wedding that never was and a womb that must be filled. The village shrine sat at the edge of a dried-up stream where the trees bowed inward and the soil never grew weeds. It was ancient, its roof sunken, its prayer stones worn smooth from wind and years of forgotten footsteps. Lien stood before it at dawn, holding her grandmother's diary in one hand and a red thread in the other. The thread had been knotted around her doorknob when she woke, wet with dew, stretched tight from the lantern's base all the way to her pillow, as if something had walked through her room in the night, as if the bride had been watching her sleep. The diary pages had changed again, new lines written in sharp strokes that pierced the paper. The pact was never honored. The veil was burned, but the name was not spoken. The groom lived, the bride did not. Lien lit 3 sticks of incense and placed them in the cracked urn beneath the shrine. The smoke drifted sideways, against the wind. She opened the diary to the pages that listed ritual rites, and there, tucked between 2 sections on burial water and protective talismans, was an entry sealed with red wax. The ghost marriage pact, only to be opened by the bride keeper. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. In cases where the bride dies before marriage, her spirit remains untethered. If rage anchors her, she must be wed to pass. Burnt offerings alone do not suffice. Her soul must be bound by 3 elements: blood, name, and groom. If no groom exists, one must be created, a paper effigy, blessed by a Taoist priest, infused with offerings from the living bloodline. Once the marriage is complete, the lantern must be lit for 30 days and never allowed to extinguish. If it cries, the pact is broken, and she will rise. Lien stared at the text, bile rising in her throat. Her grandmother had performed this ritual once for Huang, the name scratched from every family document. Her aunt, the girl who drowned in Widow's Hollow, the one whose bones now hung above the altar. And it had failed, because the groom wasn't real, because the rage had never died, because her grandmother had taken the man meant for Huang. Back in the house, she found the lacquer box beneath the floorboards of her grandmother's bedroom. Inside was a folded veil, a lock of hair tied in red string, and a faded photo of a young man in a soldier's uniform, smiling, hand resting on a girl's shoulder. Only the girl's face had been burned away. Carved beneath the photo, in trembling ink, "He chose me. I had to silence her." Lien turned the box over and found a thin strip of brittle parchment torn from an old scroll, a fragment of Taoist prayer script, its edges burned. She touched the hair, and for a brief moment she felt warmth beneath her palm, a heartbeat. She needed answers, real ones. That afternoon, she walked to the edge of the village, where the thresh forest thinned, and a narrow trail led to a hut draped in wind chimes and copper bells, the house of the old monk known as Tai Kang, the last spiritual keeper of the valley and one who had long refused to set foot in Widow's Hollow. He opened the door before she could knock. His eyes were clouded, but they held a sharpness that made her throat close. "You brought the lantern's sorrow with you," he said. "I need to know," she whispered, "about the pact, about my aunt, about the wedding that never happened." The old man sighed and motioned her inside. Inside, the air smelled of turmeric, dust, and old rain. He lit a stick of black incense and placed it upright in a bowl of salt. The ghost marriage tradition was meant to give peace, but when done with lies, it breeds something worse than ghosts. It breeds remnants, spirits that are not whole, spirits who demand completion. "She was promised," he continued, "Huang, a bright girl, but her sister, the one you call grandmother, intervened, took her groom, hid her death, lied to the gods." He sat across from Lien, his voice low. "The pact your grandmother performed was a binding, not a blessing. She didn't want to guide Huang's spirit to peace. She wanted to trap her in the lantern, in the house, in blood." "She used her pelvic bone," Lien said slowly. Tai Kang nodded once, gravely. "Such things are forbidden. The pelvis is the seat of rebirth. To carve it into a lantern is to imprison the soul in endless yearning. It becomes a vessel of rage." Lien clenched her fists. "So what do I do?" But he shook his head. "The pact has already failed. Now she wants a real wedding, a real groom, a real child. And if I don't give her that?" The old monk looked at the flame. "It won't be your house that burns. It will be you." When she returned to her house, the lantern had moved. It no longer hung by the altar. It was now resting in her bed. Its light flickered soft and pink. Beside it, carefully arranged on her pillow, were 3 things: a strand of red thread, a cracked engagement ring, and a note in her grandmother's handwriting. She will ask again. Say yes this time, or no one will ever leave this village again."
By morning, the ring was gone. So was the red thread. Only the lantern remained, quiet, soft, its flame curled like a sleeping breath. Lien stared at it from across the room, too afraid to move closer. The house was colder than before. Even sunlight, where it managed to pierce the fog, felt weak, diffused. She wrapped herself in her grandmother's old shawl and opened the diary again, this time with gloves. A new page had appeared, one she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't written in ink. It was stitched, red thread embroidered directly into the paper with trembling precision. The debt is never forgotten. The womb remembers what the mouth refuses. One bride stolen, one line cursed. Keep her quiet or carry her. The thread began to unravel as she read, falling from the page like a loose stitch in skin. She dropped the book. The lantern flared once, then went dim. That afternoon, she visited the cemetery. It lay just beyond Widow's Hollow, past a field where the grass never grew higher than a child's ankle. Rows of stone markers stood like crooked teeth in the earth, names half worn by wind and rain. She searched for Herng's. There wasn't one. But tucked between two mossy headstones, she found a small shrine nearly swallowed by vines. Its incense bowl was cracked, the offering tray empty. A single faded photograph rested behind glass. A girl in red, younger than Lien, hair tied back with white silk, eyes that stared through the frame. The nameplate beneath had been scratched off, replaced with 3 vertical slashes, almost like wedding tally marks. She lit a match, left a single stick of incense. The smoke curled and drifted sideways, just like it had at the shrine near the hollow. The air around her changed. A breeze without wind, a chill without warning. She turned, and for a moment she saw a bride in red standing between the trees, barefoot, eyes closed, veil fluttering without movement. Then she was gone. That night, the bleeding began. At first, she thought it was just her cycle, but the blood was thick, almost black and cold. It soaked through her sheets, through her clothing, and yet she felt no pain, only weight, something ancient stirring behind her navel, as though memory itself had come alive inside her. She stumbled to the bathroom, stripped her clothes, and looked in the mirror. Her reflection stared back, but behind her stood another. A woman, draped in red, veil hanging, hands crossed over her pelvis. No face, just a black void beneath the veil, and 2 eyes that bled down her neck like ink. She screamed. The mirror shattered. When she looked again, she was alone. But on the floor, in the shards, was a single baby tooth, still pink at the root, not hers. By the 5th day, the villagers avoided her completely. Doors closed when she passed. Salt was scattered behind her steps. One old man spat in her shadow and whispered, "Blood-bearer," before disappearing into his home. T wouldn't answer her calls. The diary no longer opened to blank pages. Every entry now appeared in real time, script forming while she watched. That morning it wrote, "The line was never broken, it only changed wombs. The next bride-keeper must carry the sorrow, or the child of no name will be born screaming." She slammed the book shut, but the words kept bleeding through the cover. Lien tore through the house looking for answers, anything her grandmother might have left behind. She opened closets, dismantled drawers, knocked on floorboards. In the back of the linen cupboard she found it. A wooden box sealed with human hair, tied tightly in red thread.
Inside, a bloodied wedding veil, a journal bound in lambskin, and a vial of what looked like breast milk, labeled "for the bride's mouth." She opened the journal. Its pages were written in her grandmother's hand, much younger, sharper. "I was 16 when I saw Hung float in the well, her skin pale as wax, her hands still clutching the red ribbon she tied to her ankles. I told them she ran away. I told them the merchant's son was never hers. But the hollow kept her. It whispers her name. The lantern weeps when I lie. The monk said I had two choices, give her a wedding or give her my blood. I chose the wedding, but I lied again. The groom I burned was paper. The offerings were false. She knows. She always knew. Now I bleed once a moon to keep her quiet, and when I can't, she comes." Lien closed the journal, hands trembling. She understood now. The ancestral debt was not money. It was not land. It was silence, sacrifice, shame passed down like heirloom jewelry, hidden in boxes no one dared to open. The price of betrayal was not exile. It was inheritance. And now it was hers. She returned to the lantern, lit it with a match soaked in her own blood. It flared red, then blue, then red again. The crying stopped, and a new voice spoke, not through her ears, but in the marrow of her bones. "The womb remembers, and I am not done remembering." Then the flame flickered violently, and the lantern opened at its base, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small scrap of cloth, still wet, still warm, still beating.
On the sixth night, Lien woke to the sound of drums. Not loud, not steady, just one slow beat, then silence. Another beat, then another. It echoed faintly, as if coming from under the floorboards or from deep within the hollow where the fog curled like fingers through the trees. She rose, half dazed, barefoot on cold wood, and followed the sound. It led her to the altar. The lantern hung there again, freshly lit. She had not lit it. She had not touched it. But its flame swayed to the rhythm of the drum beats. A voice whispered, "The bride keeper has awoken." In the morning, 3 old women came to the house. They wore white sashes over black aozai, their faces lined with the kind of age that spoke of generations, not years. They carried no bags, no umbrellas, only incense and a porcelain bowl wrapped in crimson silk. They did not knock. They simply stepped inside and knelt at the altar, bowing once to the lantern, once to Lien. "You are her blood," one said. "You are her debt," said the second. "You are her keeper now," said the third. Lien stood frozen, unsure if she should run or scream. The first woman rose and held out the silk-wrapped bowl. "Tonight we prepare the bride." "What bride?" Lien asked, though she already knew. "The one waiting in the hollow," they said together. "The one your grandmother betrayed. The one whose wedding was never finished. Her soul cannot leave unless the rite is completed under the blood moon." Lien's hands curled into fists. "That was decades ago. You want me to fix her mistake?" The oldest woman looked her straight in the eyes. "No, we want you to survive it." They brought her to the communal hall, a stilted wooden building, rarely used now, half rotting beneath the weight of mold and memory.
There they laid out the tools of the ritual: red thread, white rice, funeral ash, a bridal dress woven from ghost silk so thin it vanished in sunlight, and beside it, a box sealed with 7 locks. "She will need a groom," one said. "We've summoned a priest," another added. "He arrives tonight. He must not see her face. He must not speak her name. Only perform the rites and leave before dawn." Lien stared at the locks. "What's in the box?" The women looked away. Then the oldest whispered, "The rest of her." At sunset, the fog deepened and the trees began to hum, not with sound, but with pressure, an unseen weight pressing in from all directions. The Taoist priest arrived just after dark, escorted by 3 men whose mouths were covered in gauze. He was young, too young, and when he stepped into the house and saw the lantern, he froze. He began muttering under his breath, drawing talismans in the air. His eyes darted to the corners of the ceiling, to the floorboards, to the bones woven into the lantern's frame. He was told this was a binding, but this is no spirit box. This is a womb, he hissed. Lien swallowed hard. "You said you could do ghost marriage rites." He shook his head. "Not for her. She is not lingering. She is gestating." "What does that mean?" she asked, but the priest had already dropped his incense stick and backed toward the door. "You bound her wrong. You trapped a bride with no grave, no name, and no consent. She's not waiting. She's choosing." And then he fled, vanished into the mist. That night, the box unlocked itself, 1 lock at a time. Click, 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 until it opened on its own. Inside was a bridal mask carved from lacquered wood, painted red with no mouth and no eyes, just a single line down the center, a hairline fracture that pulsed as if breathing. Beneath it lay a single preserved heart, still moist, still veined, wrapped in the remnants of a wedding vow half burned. Lien read the vow aloud. "In life I was forgotten. In death I was erased. In this union I take what is owed." Then the lantern flared, and the house filled with the scent of funeral jasmine. She dreamed of the hollow again, but this time she walked among the mourners. The trees were gone, the fog was gone. In their place stood dozens of women in red veils, faceless, all holding lanterns that bled as they swayed. They walked in a circle around a blood-stained altar made of stone. On the altar was herself, dressed as a bride, limbs bound with thread. And behind her, a shadow waited, hand outstretched. "Say yes," the voice hissed. "I will be gentle this time." Lien woke with blood beneath her fingernails and the feeling that something had been taken from her during sleep. By morning, the bridal dress hung from her doorway. The box was gone, and carved into the wall beside her bed, with what looked like a fingernail, "The wedding begins at the blood moon. You will not leave before the veil falls. Bride keeper, you are the altar now."
On the 7th night, the veil arrived. Not in a box, not with ceremony. It simply appeared, folded carefully at the foot of her bed, pressed with lavender and soaked in something too dark to be perfume. Its fabric shimmered like old blood under candlelight. too heavy to be silk, too soft to be anything made by hand. Pinned to its edge was a single, brittle note. Do not wear it unless you accept her place. Do not refuse it unless you accept her wrath. Beneath the veil, the lantern flickered weakly. Its tears had slowed, but its color was now a strange, flesh pink, like something being born. Lien spent the day in silence. The village had gone quieter. Even the birds refused to sing. The dogs had vanished, and every house she passed was sealed with a talisman across the door, one she couldn't read, though it looked vaguely like the character for loss. She returned to the hollow, drawn there now not by fear, but by a pulse she could feel in her chest. It beat in sync with something underground, beneath the roots, beneath the shrine, beneath everything. She stepped into the sunken grove. The shrine was half collapsed. The earth beneath it was disturbed, as though something had recently crawled free. Her hands, without permission, began brushing away leaves, then soil, then ash. She found it, a shallow pit lined with bone fragments, shards of porcelain, and pieces of bridal jewelry, charred, melted together. A dowry, once offered, now burned. And at the center, a severed ring finger still wearing the band, still moist with something that wasn't rot. That night, the lantern refused to light. She tried oil, she tried fire. Nothing. Until she remembered the shrine, the finger, the blood. Her hands trembled as she pricked her palm with a hairpin and let a single drop fall into the lantern's base. It ignited instantly, bright red, and the veil began to hum. The diary wrote to her again, but now the ink came in lines across her arms, appearing on skin rather than page. Words rose like burns. The bride cannot cross alone. She needs your body. She needs your name. She needs your pain. Lien collapsed to the floor, feverish. A dream overtook her, hot and raw and sharp. In it, she stood before a mirror wearing the red veil. Behind her stood a faceless man dressed in old wedding robes, holding a blade instead of a ring. He kissed her neck and whispered, "You will carry her better than the last one." She woke to blood between her legs, but she was not menstruating. There were no cramps, no signs, just blood and something else. Hair, long black strands wrapped around the sheets. She clutched her abdomen and screamed. At dawn, her cousin Thea returned. He looked thinner, eyes sunken, face pale. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her with grief-heavy silence. Finally he said, "She's coming faster this time." "What do you mean?" Grandmother kept her quiet for decades, with offerings, with part of herself, her teeth, her blood, pieces of her hair. He reached into his satchel and pulled out an old bundle wrapped in yellowing cloth. Inside was a set of fingernails, clipped and blackened, tied with red string. "She gave one each time the lantern cried," he said. Lien recoiled. "That's sick." "That's survival," T whispered. That evening the villagers left offerings outside her door, but not of food, of flesh. Teeth, fingernails, locks of hair, a dried tongue,
even a bottle labeled Mother's Milk, 1987. They were wrapped in wedding invitations, none addressed to Lien, all addressed to the Bride of the Hollow. She burned them all. But the lantern screamed when she did, its flame going black, then flesh-colored, then splitting open briefly to reveal a pulsing eye at its center. It blinked once and wept again, this time from both sides. She returned to the hollow before midnight, and there she found the bride. Not a ghost, not a dream. A woman, corpse-thin, skin stitched with red thread, mouth sealed shut, standing waist-deep in the soil as though she had grown there. Veil over her face, hands folded over her chest, wedding band still tight on bone. She did not move. She only bled slowly from her feet into the ground. Lien approached, drawn forward like a marionette. "Why me?" she asked aloud. A breeze carried the answer, not from the woman, but from the lantern now floating beside her. "Because you were born from a theft. Because your name is written in her bloodline. Because she cannot rest unless someone suffers in her place. Bride keeper, you are not here to bury the past. You are here to become it."
The truth did not come as thunder. It came as a whisper from the back of a locked drawer, hidden behind a false panel, sealed with wax and old regrets. Lien found it while cleaning, though she didn't remember standing up, didn't recall moving her hands. They acted on their own, as if guided, as if summoned. Inside the compartment was a bundle of letters tied with twine, yellowed and warped by time. Atop them rested a photograph, faded, blurred at the edges by what looked like tears or rain. 2 girls, one smiling, one staring, both wearing red. One was clearly her grandmother, young, beautiful, eyes sharp like scissors. The other was Hoong. There was something unspeakably sad in her. The truth did not come as thunder. It came as a whisper from the back of a locked drawer, hidden behind a false panel, sealed with wax and old regrets. Lien found it while cleaning, though she didn't remember standing up, didn't recall moving her hands. They acted on their own, as if guided, as if summoned. Inside the compartment was a bundle of letters tied with twine, yellowed and warped by time. Atop them rested a photograph, faded, blurred at the edges by what looked like tears or rain. 2 girls, one smiling, one staring, both wearing red. One was clearly her grandmother, young, beautiful, eyes sharp like scissors. The other was Hearn. There was something unspeakably sad in her face, something distant, like she'd already been erased. And behind them, just out of focus, stood a man in military uniform, half turned, face blurred, but his hand rested on Hearn's shoulder, not the other sister's. Lien opened the first letter with shaking hands. The ink had bled through, but enough remained to read. "Sister, I know you do not approve, but he is kind. He says he will marry me after the new year, once his mother gives permission. I've told no one but you. Please keep this between us." Another. "He asked me to meet him at the Hollow tonight. He says the moon will be full, and it's where he wants to give me the ring. I'm scared, but I love him, and I trust you."
And finally, "You lied. He never came. You wore the red dress. You wore the ring. You burned my name before I died." The signature at the bottom was smeared, but it wasn't signed in ink. It was signed in blood. That night, Lien lit the lantern with a braid of her own hair. The flame turned pale gold. She sat before it cross-legged, the veil in her lap, the ring now hanging around her neck on a thread of rice stalk. And she spoke aloud, "I know what you want now." The flame wavered. "You want what was taken." She pulled out the last letter. "You want the truth returned." The flame brightened. But then she added, "And you want vengeance." The light hissed, turning black at the edges. The villagers held their breath that night. Not one lantern was lit outside. Every house had its windows nailed shut with thin wooden slats marked in chicken blood. Even the animals had been hidden away. Thi came again, this time not alone. He brought with him an elder woman, blind and thin as rice paper, her spine bent like a fishing hook. She did not speak. She only placed her hand on Lien's head and wept. She was Heng's midwife. She saw what happened before the end, Thi said. She wasn't pregnant. No, Thi replied, but she was becoming. Becoming what? He said nothing, only placed a small red pouch in her hands. Inside, a piece of bone, carved with Heng's name. "The last part of her," he said, "the one your grandmother hid in her own altar, to bind her, to silence her." Later that evening, Lien stood before the family shrine. She removed every offering dish, every portrait, every candle, and in their place she laid the letters, the ring, the veil, the carved bone, and finally, the photograph. She lit a new stick of incense and whispered into the smoke, "You were betrayed." The flame leaned toward her. "She stole him from you." The walls creaked. "She wore your dress." The air dropped in temperature. "And she watched you drown." The lantern behind her blazed to life, and a voice, so loud it cracked the ceiling, screamed, "Yes!" The house trembled. The walls began to bleed ink, long vertical lines that dripped from the ceiling beams to the floor. On every wall, the same character appeared. Yuan, injustice, wronged soul. Outside, the wind rose like a howl, and in the hollow, the trees began to bend, not from storm, but from something pulling them inward, toward the shrine, toward the buried lie. Lien staggered backward, but the altar was gone. In its place stood the bride. Not a ghost, not a corpse, but something in between. Dressed in red, the veil down, her skin pale as porcelain but cracked, her fingers stitched with red thread, her mouth sewn shut, but her eyes were Lien's. And behind her the lantern floated, no longer crying, but glowing steadily, as if finally satisfied. The bride held out her hands. In them she carried the burned vow. On it, in blood, "If I cannot rest, you will walk in my place. If I was denied, then you will suffer the wedding I never had." The veil lifted slowly, and for the first time Lien saw Heng's full face. It wasn't monstrous, it wasn't twisted, it was beautiful and terribly sad. And in that sadness was something older than death, a grief so deep it had rotted into rage. "I didn't betray you," Lien whispered. But the bride only shook her head. And behind her, the forest caught fire, without smoke, without flame, just trees turning to ash, as though the past had finally burned its way into the present. The bride stepped forward and placed the ring on Lien's finger. Now you wear what was never yours. Now you carry what I could not.
Lien woke with a weight in her belly. Not pain, not illness, but a dense, pulsating pressure, like something coiled deep inside her had begun to breathe. She sat up slowly, sweat soaking her back, her skin cold. Lien woke with a weight in her belly. Not pain, not illness, but a dense, pulsating pressure, like something coiled deep inside her had begun to breathe. She sat up slowly, sweat soaking her back, her skin cold despite the burning incense and summer heat. The ring on her finger had turned black. The veil lay across her feet, and beneath it, pressed against her abdomen, was a single note scrawled in soot. You wore the dress. You spoke the name. Now you carry the bride. She lifted her shirt with trembling hands. There, just beneath her navel, was a red mark, a perfect circle, shaped like a bridal seal, with a single vertical slash through it. The character for birth, but inverted, as if to mock her, as if to mark her. She ran to the village clinic. Empty. Dust had settled on the examination table. The stirrups were rusted. No one had used it in years. She tried to call Fee. No answer. Tried to call anyone. Her phone wouldn't even turn on. She collapsed in the clinic chair, panting, gripping her stomach. And then she felt it. Movement. Something inside her shifted. Not a flutter, not gas. A deliberate roll like a fetus changing sides. But she wasn't pregnant. She couldn't be. She hadn't, unless... She thought of the dreams, the faceless groom, the altar, the blood, the burning veil, the tongue in her mouth that wasn't hers. She doubled over and screamed. That night the villagers held a vigil, not for her, for the hollow. The old women sat around fires with their eyes closed and faces turned away from the woods. Children were hidden in cellars, no doors opened, no lights were lit. And somewhere in the fog, the sound of wedding drums began to beat again, this time steady, this time rhythmic. And behind the beat, the soft chime of 1,000 anklets, each one walking just behind her window. Lien began to see her own reflection behave differently. It lagged. It smiled when she didn't. It moved its lips and mouthed things she couldn't hear. In the mirror, she looked pregnant, not visibly, not round, but full, as if something ancient had made a nest beneath her skin. The diary no longer accepted her touch. Every time she opened it, the ink bled away from her fingers, leaving only one line: "She is already inside you." The next morning, she vomited thread. Red silk poured from her mouth like bile, endless and tangled, wrapped with tiny bones, teeth no larger than rice grains. She screamed until her throat cracked. When it stopped, she looked into the basin, and there, floating among the silk, was a single fetus-shaped doll, paper, burned at the edges, wrapped in a bridal sash. She tried to destroy it. It didn't burn. She began losing time, waking in strange places, wearing the veil without memory, finding herself deep in the hollow at dawn, barefoot and bloodied. The villagers stopped approaching her completely, even Thee. He left offerings at her gate now, never ringing the bell, never making eye contact. And then one night, the bell at the shrine rang, without wind, 12 times, and the diary wrote, without ink, "The bride has chosen her vessel. The child will be born on the night of the blood moon. She will come through your breath,
through your bones, through your name." She returned to the priest's house, desperate. The young Taoist who had fled now lived in exile at the base of the mountain, refusing to speak of what he saw. But when she arrived, he was already waiting at the threshold, pale and shaking. "You let her in," he whispered. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." He pressed a talisman into her palm, shaking. "This won't stop her, but it might give you clarity." She unfolded the paper. It was soaked with blood. Her own handwriting covered it. She didn't remember writing it. It read, "I dreamed of her before I was born. She waited in the hollow for decades, but I was always meant to be her door." She dropped the talisman and ran. In her dreams that night, she gave birth. The delivery was silent. No pain, no blood. Just her laying on cold stones, surrounded by faceless women humming in unison. And between her legs, the bride emerged whole, adult-sized, wearing red, smiling. "She needed a mother," one of the women whispered. "She made one." Lien awoke, cradling the bridal mask in her arms like an infant. It cooed once, then went still, and the ring on her finger cracked in half.
Silence took the village by the throat. It was not the gentle quiet of dawn, not the hush of reverence, but a heavy, swollen silence, pregnant with fear. No birds, no footsteps, not even the wind dared speak. It was as if the earth itself held its breath. And at the center of that silence stood Lien. She no longer left the house. There was no need. Everything came to her now. The offerings, the whispers, the visions, the threads tightening beneath her skin. The villagers called her May, Kuai Am, mother of the ghost bride. They whispered it behind closed doors. Some said she was possessed. Some said she was divine. But all agreed on one thing. She was no longer alone. The diary had stopped bleeding. The lantern no longer wept. It pulsed now, glowing like a heartbeat, its flames synchronized with something moving inside her. Each night Lien felt it stir. Not a child, not a spirit, but a presence. It curled against her spine like memory. It climbed her ribs like regret. And every time she tried to sleep, it whispered in her own voice, "Open the ground. Let me through. The hollow waits for the bride." She followed the pull on the 11th night, barefoot, veiled, no lantern, no torch. She moved as if called by name. The forest parted for her, the fog cleared from her path, and the trees bent to listen. When she reached the hollow, she didn't stop. She walked into the heart of it, where the shrine had once stood. Now there was only dirt, soft, fresh, breathing. She knelt and began to dig, with her hands, with her nails, with fingers that tore and bled and cracked. She dug until her knuckles struck stone, then bone, then something else. A lid, wood, half-rotted, engraved with the same 3 marks carved behind her bed. Yuan, wronged. Sheng, birth. Huen, marriage. She opened it and found the well. It was shallow, maybe 4 feet deep, lined with teeth, baby teeth, adult teeth, animal teeth, all arranged in circles, each ring smaller than the last, a spiral of offerings. At the center was a stone altar, smooth, dark, wet. She reached for it,
but the second her fingers touched the stone, she felt her legs give out. Her body didn't fall. It was taken by something inside the hollow, something with roots in her spine and nails in her womb. And then she was somewhere else. The hollow vanished. She stood in an underground chamber, walls carved with wedding vows in every language of the dead. 1,000 brides in red stood around her, their veils fluttering with no wind. At the center of them all was Hung, no longer cracked, no longer faceless, but whole, young, smiling. She reached out a hand. Lian took it, and they merged, not in body, but in purpose. When she awoke, she was in the house again. The floor beneath her cracked. The walls were covered in script, none she recognized, all written in blood. The veil had become a second skin, stitched into her back, trailing behind her like smoke. She could no longer remove it. The lantern hovered in front of her face now. It didn't drip. It breathed. Every time it pulsed, she remembered something that wasn't hers. Hung's laughter in a jasmine garden. The taste of river water filling lungs. The betrayal of watching her sister wear the ring. The memories nested in her mind like eggs, and she could feel them hatching. The village called for a meeting. What was left of it? Only a dozen came. The rest had fled or locked themselves away. They did not come to offer help. They came to beg. "Let it stop," one woman said. "We gave the bride everything," another added. "She doesn't want offerings," Lian whispered. "She wants to be born." A silence thicker than guilt settled in the room. T stood behind them, pale and trembling. He finally spoke. "We must give her what was denied. A wedding, a witness, a womb." Lian looked at him. "I already gave her my body," she said. He met her eyes. "But you haven't given her your death." That night, the hollow called again. But this time, she didn't walk. She descended. Through the cracks in her own home, beneath the floorboards, down into the bone well. And at the bottom was the altar, lit by flame, surrounded by bridal masks, all weeping. And in the center, a red cloth pulsing like a heart. She laid her hand upon it, and the hollow spoke through her mouth. "The bride is ready. The moon is full. Prepare the ceremony." The blood moon rose without announcement. No thunder, no scream, just red light spilling over Widow's Hollow like a wound reopening. The sky was bruised, the air was too still, and in the center of the village, every lantern, every ordinary flame snuffed out one by one, except hers. The bone lantern pulsed with a crimson glow, casting shadows that danced like veiled women on the walls. Its flame had grown fat, pregnant with something unseen, and tonight it would finally open. Lian stood in her grandmother's wedding aozai, only it was no longer white. It had turned red, not from dye, but from bleeding thread, the fabric alive, pulsing softly at her ribs, stitching itself tighter the longer she breathed. She no longer wept. She no longer questioned. She had become a vessel. Her body hummed with memories not her own. She could recite Hung's lullabies. She knew how to grind her mother's funeral herbs. She remembered the feeling of a ring slipping off her finger as she drowned. And now she carried them all. Their rage, their longing, their death. Tonight, she would return it. The path from the house to the hollow had changed. The trees parted like curtains. The earth smoothed beneath her feet. The air bowed as she passed. She walked barefoot, the bone lantern floating ahead of her, tethered by a thin red thread looped through her finger. Behind her, the villagers followed in silence, heads bowed, mouths sewn shut with red silk. Not by force, but by tradition. They were witnesses, not participants. They would see the wedding through or perish with her. At the mouth of the hollow, a procession waited, not of the living, but of the brides that never wed. They stood in concentric circles, each wearing a veil soaked in funeral oil, their hands folded, their toes hovering inches above the ground. None breathed, none blinked, but all turned their heads in perfect unison as Lien stepped into the hollow. The altar was ready, carved from stone blackened by age, rimmed with bridal bones, and set with 7 ceremonial objects: a red comb, a jar of black water, a bridal sash soaked in placenta, a paper effigy of the stolen groom, a shard of mirror from Hung's burial veil, the broken ring, and Lien's own name written backward in blood. She knelt, not because she wanted to, but because her body remembered the vow. The lantern hovered over the altar. It pulsed once, then began to unravel. The bone segments creaked open like ribs, revealing a core of meat and thread and fire. From within came a wet sound, as if something crawled inside it, something waking. The veil lifted on its own, and Hung stepped forward, whole, radiant, veins glowing beneath her skin, no longer decaying, but born anew through Lien's form. She hovered over the altar, arms outstretched, her voice now woven into every gust of wind. I was promised, I was buried with silence, but tonight I wear her skin. Tonight I walk again. The villagers knelt. The brides hummed a song without words, and the bone lantern began to chant in Lien's voice. Bound not by love, but by betrayal, sealed not in silk, but in marrow, given not a name, but a hunger. Lien's eyes rolled back, her arms lifted skyward, and from her belly came a sound, not a scream, not a cry, but the wail of something being born in reverse. The altar split, the stone cracked open like an egg, and from within emerged a mirror, slick with fluid, reflecting not Lien's face, but Hung's wedding night. The man, the bed, the knife, the betrayal. She had slit her own wrists on bridal sheets, but no one had found her body because she had walked into the hollow still breathing, and the earth swallowed her before the blood could cool. The ceremony neared its end. Hung reached for Lien's mouth, unthreaded it, pulled out the red silk that kept her silent, and whispered, "Give me the final vow." Lien choked on the words. Her body tried to obey, but something in her soul rebelled, fought, burned. "No," she rasped, "you were wronged, but I am not yours." The brides around her hissed. The villagers turned away. The lantern flared white-hot, and Hung's face twisted, not in anger, but in grief. "You were supposed to be my home, my voice, my justice. I am not your justice. I am your grave. And then she did the unthinkable. She reached into the bone lantern, into its core of flame and flesh, and ripped it open. The scream that followed was not hers. It was 1,000 voices shrieking at once. The bride scattered, the altar crumbled, the hollow trembled, and Hung, the bride reborn, let out a final sob before dissolving into ash in Lien's arms. The bone lantern shattered, its light gone, its weeping ended, and the veil fell limp around her shoulders. The ceremony was over, but something had changed. Something had stayed.
Lien did not wake up. She returned to herself, to her body, to a world that no longer hummed with ancestral song, but rang with the ache of silence after screaming. She lay on the altar floor, covered in ash and thread, the bone lantern shattered at her side. Her palms were burned. Her hair was matted with red clay. But she was alive. And she was alone. The brides had vanished. The hollow was empty. Even the fog had withdrawn, as though exhausted by the ritual. But something remained. Something inside her. She stumbled back to the house at sunrise. Not a single bird sang. Not a single dog barked. The entire village was gone. Doors left swinging open, food left rotting on mats, talismans fluttering from strings with no hands left to tie them. It was as if the village had never existed. Only the house, her house, still stood, and the altar room had changed. The walls were freshly painted white. The old photos were gone. And in their place, framed neatly in the center of the room, hung a portrait of her. But it was not her now. It was her dressed as a bride, face veiled, hands folded, belly round. Beneath the frame, a single line in charcoal. She kept her promise. Lien collapsed to her knees. Tears refused to come. Her body felt dry, hollowed out like a bell that had rung itself silent. She lifted her shirt. The red birthmark was gone. But beneath her skin, she still felt something twitch. Something waiting. That night, the dreams returned. But this time, they did not belong to Hern. They belonged to Lien's own mother. She stood at the altar, much younger, her belly full, her face haunted. And she was whispering, "I tried to stop her. I told your grandmother the curse must end, but I was weak. I passed it to you." Lien tried to reach her, but the dream shifted, and now she stood before a mirror, only it didn't show her reflection. It showed the bride, whole, silent, beautiful, wearing Lien's skin. She reached up, removed her veil, and at last Lien saw her true face, and it was hers. Not hers, not a ghost, not a stranger. It had always been her own face. The pain, the inheritance, the betrayal, they were not memories passed down. They were planted, fed, grown from within. She was not just chosen, she was designed. She awoke with blood between her legs, but not from menstruation,
but from birth. A small bundle lay at her side on the floor, wrapped in red cloth, motionless. She reached for it, trembling, unwrapped it slowly. It was not a child. It was the bridal mask, now cracked down the middle. Inside, instead of a face, lay a shriveled umbilical cord, knotted around a jade ring, the ring that once belonged to the man in the photograph. It pulsed with heat, and then it whispered. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to be remembered, and she wanted to live. Lien buried the mask in the hollow. She dug with her hands, bleeding into the earth, sobbing not for her, but for herself, for the girl she had been before she ever came back, the girl who thought her family's ghosts were only stories, the girl who didn't know grief could be inherited like blood. She laid the mask on a bed of salt and teeth, then covered it with soil. No ritual, no fire, no vows. Just silence, just surrender, just release. That night, the forest breathed again. The fog returned, but it was soft now. The air no longer pulsed with memory. It simply settled. The veil no longer clung to her shoulders. It lay folded on the altar, dry and faded. And the diary's last page appeared, blank, except for a single sentence, written in Lien's own hand. The bride was never her. The bride was always me.
The villagers never came back, not in person, not in story, not in rumor. Their homes remained standing, quiet shells beneath vines and dust, but their souls had scattered like ash in wind. Widow's Hollow was now a place unmarked, known only by the silence it left behind. Lien was the only one who remained, not because she wanted to, but because she was now part of it, bound to it, named by it. Days passed like funeral incense, slow and sweet and suffocating. She cleaned the house, not to restore it, but to remember what was real. She found old family scrolls hidden in the ceiling, birth records, marriage logs, ancestral diagrams, each name carefully inked, each connection drawn by hand. But one name appeared again and again, then was always crossed out: Hung. She was never officially recorded as dead, never listed as married, never honored on the family altar. She had become a ghost by omission. One afternoon, a knock came. Not on the door, but on her spine. A sharp twinge, as if something long buried had tapped its way up through her bones. She fell to her knees, coughed into her hand, and saw ash. Not soot, not dust, bone ash. It bled from her mouth like regret. The taste was bitter, familiar. It was the taste of the lantern, the rituals, the pact. She crawled to the mirror, and there it was, her reflection, mouth streaked with gray, eyes bloodshot, hair streaked with white. And behind her, barely visible, Kung. Not full, not angry, just present, watching, waiting. She returned to the hollow, this time not as a vessel, but as a witness. The earth there was cracked open now, wide and yawning like a throat.
And within, the bone altar still smoldered, but something had changed. The stones had crumbled inward, forming a shallow basin where ash had collected. Not scattered, gathered, as though waiting for something. She climbed in, knees touching teeth, hands cupping fragments. And there, half buried, she found a scroll sealed in red wax, old, brittle. She unrolled it slowly. It was titled, "The Bone Ash Reversal, Right of Return for Spirits Bound by Flesh and Silence." She read every line, and as she read, the fog around the hollow thickened, becoming heavier, warmer, filled with scent. Jasmine, clay, blood. She whispered the incantation. "By the ash I carry, by the blood I owe, return not to hunger, but to shadow. Let memory burn, let flesh forget, let the unborn rest where names are kept." The ash in her hands glowed, then ignited. But it did not burn her. It sank into her palms, marking her with inkless tattoos that curled up her forearms and stopped just below the shoulder. The rite was complete, but the curse wasn't broken, only absorbed. Later that evening, a man arrived, older, foreign, eyes clouded by time and knowledge. He introduced himself in slow Vietnamese, broken but respectful. A Taoist archivist. He had read of the lantern in a banned ritual compendium from the French colonial era. The Lantern of Widow Bone, it was called. A cursed vessel used in only 3 known villages across Southeast Asia, 2 of which had vanished entirely. He said, "Your village was the 3rd one, and the only one that tried to bind the bride through inheritance." He took one look at the hollow and paled. He said, "She was never meant to pass through flesh. They tried to contain sorrow inside a womb, but sorrow doesn't die when you give it a name." He examined Lien's arms, saw the markings. He said, "These are not protections, they are permissions." "For what?" she asked. He looked toward the forest, then back at her. "For others." That night, Lien lit a single candle at the altar. She no longer kept her grandmother's incense. She no longer burned paper offerings. She wrote names, all the women who had vanished from the family tree, all those who were erased. She spoke them out loud, one by one, as the candle burned low. The house creaked with every syllable, and somewhere behind her, someone wept, softly, not out of vengeance, but of remembrance. In the morning, the markings on her arms were gone, but her skin remained warm, branded by history. She opened the diary one last time. Its pages were blank, except for the very last leaf. At the bottom, in charcoal script, the bride no longer waits, but the house remembers. The village was green again. The rice paddies filled with water. The bamboo grew straight. The crows returned to the rooftops. But no one came back. Not the elders, not the children, not even Thi. Only Lien remained, the last name on the altar, the final voice to speak the vow. Years passed quietly. She did not age the way others did. Her skin grew paler but never wrinkled. Her hair whitened early but never fell. She moved through the house like an echo, still, patient, forgotten. The villagers' homes decayed. The paths grew moss, but her house remained untouched, preserved, as if the land remembered the weight of her promise. And then one spring evening, a cry split the silence. It was not a scream. It was not a ghost. It was a child. Lien stepped outside for the first time in weeks. At the edge of the rice field stood a girl, no more than 5, barefoot, wrapped in a tattered school uniform, eyes wide with wonder. She was alone. Lien brought her in, fed her, washed the dirt from her feet. The girl never spoke, not once, but she smiled when she saw the altar, and she stared at the veil for hours. They lived together for 3 seasons. Lien taught her how to write names in calligraphy, how to fold rice paper into doves, how to listen for the hollow's breath. The girl still did not speak, but she watched. She watched everything. She especially watched the lantern. Though it no longer glowed, no longer wept, she would sit beside it and tilt her head, listening as if to music Lien couldn't hear. One night, Lien woke to find the girl gone. She searched the house. Nothing. She ran through the village. No trace. Until she reached the hollow. And there, standing barefoot at the mouth of the sunken grove, was the girl. In her hand, a red thread, trailing into the darkness. Around her finger, the jade ring. And in the air, a voice whispered. She does not remember, but her bones do. The child turned to Lien. Finally, she spoke. "Can I keep the lantern?" Lien's heart stopped. The question was innocent, but the voice was not. It was soft, familiar, a voice she'd carried, a voice that had once curled inside her ribs and whispered of revenge and rebirth. Lien knelt, tears in her eyes. "No," she said, but the girl only smiled and turned away. By morning, the girl was gone again, and in her place, hanging from the old hallway beam, was the lantern. Whole, rebuilt, bone cage, crimson flame, dripping slowly onto the altar beneath it. It wept, not in grief, but in hunger. Lien knew then. The ritual had not ended. It had only changed hands. The curse, the sorrow, the name, it had all been passed, not broken. The bride was not buried. She had simply moved on, chosen a new vessel, a new girl, a new keeper. Lien packed her grandmother's journal, the scrolls, the offerings, everything the girl would one day need. She placed them gently into a box, wrapped it in silk, tied it with red thread, and set it on the shrine. A note beside it read, "When the veil calls you, don't run. Light the lantern. Speak the names. And remember, she only wants to be born." Then Lien walked into the hollow, alone, unarmed, ready. She stepped into the well of teeth, lay down on the altar of bone, folded her hands over her chest, and waited for the earth to close. Somewhere far away in another village, a new family welcomed a foster child, a girl with wide eyes, a quiet voice, and a red thread tied tightly around her wrist. When asked her name, she said nothing, but at night she whispered to her toys, and each morning she would draw circles of ash on the floor and hum an old wedding song no one remembered teaching her. Because the bride never died, she only changed her name, and the lantern always finds home.